The narrative of Black America has too often been told through the lens of suffering and victimhood, obscuring a far more powerful truth that demands recognition. Throughout the darkest chapters of American history, when white supremacist terrorism sought to crush the spirit and aspirations of black communities, resistance was not merely an act of defiance. It was a declaration of humanity's refusal to be extinguished. This documentary unveils the extraordinary moments when black Americans, faced with the choice between submission and self-defense, chose to stand their ground with courage that would echo through generations. These were not isolated incidents, but rather coordinated acts of collective resistance that demonstrated the indomitable will of a people who understood that freedom, without the willingness to defend it, was merely another form of bondage. From the smoky battlefields of Reconstruction to the tense standoffs of the Jim Crow era, black communities organized themselves into armed defense units, mutual protection societies, and strategic resistance networks that challenged the very foundations of white supremacist power. The stories you are about to encounter have been deliberately suppressed, minimized, or erased from mainstream historical accounts because they disrupt the comfortable narrative of passive suffering that has long dominated discussions of black history. These accounts reveal men and women who were veterans, farmers, business owners and parents, ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances who made the conscious decision that their lives, their families and their communities were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. What follows is not a celebration of violence, but rather an honest reckoning with the brutal reality that black Americans faced and the remarkable courage they displayed when confronted with systematic terrorism designed to keep them subjugated and powerless. The summer heat of 1919 hung heavy over Charleston, South Carolina, as Clayton Merriweather surveyed the modest collection of firearms spread across the wooden table in the back room of Bethel AME Church. A decorated veteran of the Great War who had fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Clayton had returned home to find that the democracy he had risked his life to defend in Europe did not extend to black citizens in the American South. The room was filled with 24 other black veterans, their faces etched with the same grim determination that had carried them through the trenches of France, now channeled toward a different kind of warfare on their own soil. These men had tasted a measure of respect and equality while serving under the American flag overseas, and they were unwilling to return to the degrading subjugation that white supremacists demanded of them. The weapons on the table, Springfield rifles, Colt revolvers, and ammunition carefully rationed and hidden from white authorities, represented more than mere instruments of self-defense. They symbolized a fundamental rejection of the notion that black lives could be terrorized with impunity. The catalyst for this gathering had come 3 weeks earlier, when a mob of white vigilantes, emboldened by the Red Summer racial violence sweeping across the nation, had attempted to lynch Theodore Washington, a black businessman accused of the fabricated crime of insulting a white woman by failing to step off the sidewalk quickly enough when she approached. What the mob had not anticipated was that Theodore's neighbors, many of them veterans like Clayton, had organized a watch system specifically to prevent such atrocities. When the lynch mob arrived at Theodore's home near midnight, they were met not with cowering victims, but with armed black men positioned strategically around the property, their military training evident in their defensive formation. The would-be lynchers, accustomed to terrorizing unarmed and isolated victims, found themselves staring down the barrels of military-grade weapons held by men who had survived the horrors of modern warfare and were unintimidated by domestic terrorists. After a tense standoff that lasted nearly an hour, the white mob retreated, their plans for murder thwarted by black Americans who had decided that the era of unopposed racial terrorism was coming to an end. The success of that night's defense had galvanized the black community in Charleston, leading to the formation of what they called the Lowcountry Protection League, a network of armed resistance that would spread across South Carolina's coastal regions. Clayton Merriweather, drawing upon his military experience and natural leadership abilities, organized the group into cells that could respond rapidly to threats against any black household or business in their area. They established communication systems using church bells, coded messages delivered by trusted children, and signals that could alert the entire network within minutes of an impending attack. The organization operated with strict discipline and clear rules of engagement. They would not initiate violence, but they would absolutely defend their community with whatever force was necessary. White authorities, including the sheriff and town council, were fully aware of the Protection League's existence, but found themselves in an awkward position. They could hardly arrest black veterans for exercising the same Second Amendment rights that white citizens claimed as sacrosanct, especially when these men had recently served their country in war. The unspoken understanding that emerged represented a delicate détente. As long as black citizens defended only their own property and persons without engaging in offensive actions, white authorities would refrain from direct confrontation, recognizing that any attempt to disarm these organized veterans would likely result in a bloodbath that would attract national attention and federal intervention. Reverend Samuel Hutchins stood in his pulpit that Sunday morning in August, his powerful voice filling every corner of Bethel AME Church as he delivered a sermon that would become legendary in Charleston's black community for generations to come. The Reverend, who had served as a chaplain during the war and had witnessed both the nobility and brutality that human beings were capable of, spoke not of turning the other cheek, but of the biblical imperative to protect the innocent and resist evil in all its forms. His words resonated with a congregation that had grown weary of watching their sons murdered, their daughters violated, and their hard-won property destroyed by white mobs that faced no legal consequences for their crimes. The Lord did not bring us through the Middle Passage, through centuries of bondage, through the trials of Reconstruction, and through the trenches of France, only to watch us be slaughtered like sheep in our own homes, Reverend Hutchins proclaimed, his voice rising with righteous anger that electrified everyone present. He reminded his congregation that even Jesus had driven the money changers from the temple with a whip, that sometimes righteousness demanded action rather than passive acceptance of injustice. The theological justification that Reverend Hutchins provided was crucial for many in the community who struggled to reconcile their Christian faith with the necessity of armed self-defense, particularly the older generation who had been raised on doctrines of non-resistance and faith in divine justice. Yet the Reverend made a compelling case that allowing one's family to be murdered when one possessed the means to prevent it was not Christian virtue, but rather a dereliction of the fundamental duty to protect those whom God had placed in one's care. He cited biblical passages about defending the weak, about shepherds protecting their flocks from wolves, about the righteous use of force in service of justice and protection of the innocent. His sermon acknowledged the real risks that armed resistance entailed, the possibility of white retaliation, the likelihood of increased surveillance and harassment by authorities, the potential for any defensive action to be twisted into a justification for even greater oppression. But he also spoke of the spiritual death that came from living in constant fear, of the psychological damage inflicted upon children who grew up watching their parents humiliated and abused without resistance, of the corrosive effect that powerlessness had upon the soul of a community. In the days following that sermon, membership in the Lowcountry Protection League swelled as men and women who had been hesitant to join an armed resistance movement found their moral courage fortified by spiritual authority. Elderly women who had survived slavery itself contributed their savings to purchase ammunition. Teenagers too young to carry weapons served as lookouts and messengers. Business owners provided meeting spaces and cover for the organization's activities. The movement had evolved beyond a simple self-defense network into something more profound, a community-wide assertion of dignity and humanity that rejected the dehumanizing premises upon which white supremacy was built. white. Residents of Charleston began to notice a change in the demeanor of black citizens. The downcast eyes and deferential posture that had been enforced through terror were replaced by a quiet confidence and self-respect that unnerved those who had grown comfortable with black subjugation. The psychological impact of organized armed resistance extended far beyond the immediate deterrent effect it had on potential lynch mobs. It fundamentally altered the power dynamics and social relationships that had governed racial interactions in the South for generations, proving that white supremacy's hold on the region depended ultimately upon black acquiescence and fear rather than any inherent superiority or inevitable social order. While Clayton Merriweather and the male veterans of the Protection League received most of the public attention and credit for organizing armed resistance, the true backbone of the movement was a network of black women whose contributions were equally essential, yet deliberately kept hidden from white scrutiny. Chief among these women was Dolores Freeman, a 53-year-old seamstress who operated a small shop on King Street that served as a covert hub for resistance activities. Dolores had been born into slavery in the final years before emancipation, and she carried memories of her father being beaten to death by an overseer while her mother was forced to watch, a trauma that had instilled in her a fierce determination that such atrocities would not continue unchallenged in the lives of her children and grandchildren. Her dressmaking shop, which catered to both black and white clientele, provided the perfect cover for resistance work. White women who came for fittings never suspected that the fabric shipments Dolores received often contained carefully concealed weapons and ammunition smuggled in from sympathetic contacts in northern cities. Dolores worked in coordination with a group of women she had known since childhood, including Ernestine Baptiste, a midwife whose profession gave her legitimate reasons to travel throughout the black community at all hours of the day and night, and Josephine Crawford, who ran a boarding house that frequently accommodated visiting black businessmen and professionals who could serve as couriers for information and materials. These women created an intelligence network that was in many ways more sophisticated and effective than the men's more visible armed patrols, gathering information about planned Klan activities, identifying which white officials could be reasoned with and which were irredeemably committed to violence, and maintaining communication with black communities throughout the region to coordinate defensive strategies. The women's network operated on the principle that knowledge was just as powerful a weapon as any firearm. Advance warning of a planned attack could mean the difference between a successful defense and a massacre, while information about the identities and movements of white terrorists could be used to apply economic and social pressure through carefully orchestrated boycotts and other forms of nonviolent resistance that complemented the armed defense strategy. The female leadership of the resistance also took primary responsibility for what they called the children's education, a systematic effort to ensure that the next generation understood both the history of black resistance and the practical skills needed to continue that tradition. In Sunday school classes, church socials, and informal gatherings, young people were taught not only literacy and numeracy, but also situational awareness, community loyalty, and the principles of organized resistance. Girls learned that their contributions were just as valuable as those of boys, that intelligence gathering and community organizing were essential skills, and that resistance to oppression took many forms beyond direct confrontation. Boys were taught discipline, tactical thinking, and marksmanship, but always within a framework that emphasized these skills as tools for community defense rather than aggression or criminality. The women understood that sustaining long-term resistance required building a culture and consciousness that would outlast any particular confrontation or crisis, that the struggle for dignity and freedom was generational rather than momentary. This educational initiative ensured that even if the current generation of resistance leaders were killed or imprisoned, the knowledge, skills, and spirit of resistance would continue, carried forward by young people who had been systematically prepared to assume those responsibilities when their time came. The night of September 17th, 1919, would prove to be the decisive test of whether the Lowcountry Protection League's strategy of armed resistance could actually prevent racial violence, or whether it would merely provoke the massive white retaliation that skeptics had predicted. Word had reached Dolores Freeman's network that a large gathering of Klansmen and their sympathizers was being organized at a farmhouse outside the city, with plans to conduct a series of raids targeting multiple black businesses and homes in what was intended to be a coordinated campaign of terror designed to crush the spirit of resistance that had been growing in Charleston's black community. The intelligence was unusually detailed, including the approximate number of participants, nearly 200 armed white men, the planned routes they would take into the black neighborhoods, and even the specific targets they intended to attack. Clayton Merriweather called an emergency meeting of the Protection League's leadership, and for several hours they debated whether to evacuate the targeted areas, attempt to defend multiple locations simultaneously with their limited numbers, or take the unprecedented step of confronting the Klan gathering before it could mobilize into the city. The decision they ultimately made was bold to the point of recklessness, yet it reflected the military thinking that Clayton had absorbed during his service in France. Rather than waiting to fight a defensive battle on multiple fronts against a numerically superior force, they would take the initiative and strike at the enemy's staging area while the white terrorists were still gathering and organizing. Shortly after midnight, 35 members of the Protection League, many of them Great War veterans with combat experience, moved through the darkness toward the farmhouse where the Klan was assembling. They positioned themselves in a defensive perimeter surrounding the property, with clear fields of fire and protected positions that made use of the terrain's natural cover. When the first caravan of vehicles began arriving with the additional Klansmen around 1 in the morning, Clayton stepped into the road with a lantern, backed by armed men positioned in the darkness on both sides. His message to the arriving white supremacists was delivered with military precision and unmistakable resolve. "Gentlemen, we know why you're gathered here tonight. We know what you plan to do, and we're here to inform you that it will not be happening. Return to your homes peacefully, and there will be no violence. Attempt to proceed with your plans, and you will find that black men who survived the German army are not frightened by bedsheets and burning crosses." The standoff that followed was a study in psychological warfare and nerve, as the Klansmen found themselves in an unexpected tactical situation where they were the ones being confronted rather than doing the confronting. Some of the white men wanted to fight despite the ambush they had walked into, their pride and racism unwilling to accept being thwarted by black men, regardless of the tactical disadvantages. Others, particularly those who were businessmen and civic leaders rather than violence-seeking thugs, quickly calculated that a shootout would be a disaster, regardless of who won. If the black defenders were killed, it would certainly bring federal investigation, given that many were decorated veterans, while if the Klansmen were defeated, the humiliation would be unbearable and the legal consequences potentially severe. For nearly 2 hours, tense negotiations played out in the darkness, with Clayton maintaining his position that the Protection League would not fire first, but would absolutely defend themselves if attacked, while more moderate voices among the Klansmen argued for withdrawal. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the decision was made to disperse, with the white men returning to their homes and the planned night of terror effectively cancelled. The black defenders maintained their positions until well after sunrise, ensuring that the withdrawal was genuine and not a feint designed to lure them into dropping their guard. The news of the confrontation spread through both the black and white communities of Charleston with astonishing speed, though the two populations heard vastly different versions of what had occurred. In the black community, the story was celebrated as a turning point, a moment when organized resistance had actually prevented violence rather than simply responding to it after the fact, proof that the strategy of armed self-defense could be effective in deterring white terrorism. Church services that Sunday were filled with prayers of thanksgiving and renewed commitment to the Protection League's mission, with collections taken up to purchase additional weapons and ammunition for the organization. Young people who had been uncertain about the wisdom of armed resistance now sought to join the movement, inspired by the courage of men and women who had stood up to overwhelming numbers and prevailed through superior organization, training, and resolve. The elderly, many of whom had lived their entire lives under the shadow of racial terrorism, spoke with something approaching disbelief about the possibility that their children and grandchildren might grow up in a world where white mobs could not murder black people with impunity. In the white community, however, the response was more complex and divided than one might have expected. Hardline white supremacists were predictably enraged, viewing the confrontation as an intolerable challenge to the racial hierarchy that they believed was both natural and necessary for Southern society. They demanded that the sheriff arrest Clayton Merriweather and the other Protection League members for what they characterized as armed insurrection and threatening white citizens, conveniently omitting the fact that those white citizens had been gathering to conduct a campaign of terrorist violence against black homes and businesses. But other whites, particularly business owners and civic leaders who were concerned about Charleston's reputation and economic development, were quietly relieved that a potential massacre had been averted and worried about the negative attention that racial violence was bringing to Southern cities in the wake of the Red Summer riots that had erupted across the nation. Some of these more pragmatic whites even acknowledged privately that black veterans who had proven their courage and loyalty in France deserved a measure of respect, and that perhaps the old methods of racial control were becoming counterproductive in the modern era. The sheriff, caught between these competing pressures and acutely aware that any attempt to arrest the Protection League's leadership would likely result in armed confrontation that his department was not prepared to handle, chose a path of studied inaction. He publicly stated that since no violence had actually occurred, and since property rights and self-defense were fundamental American principles, he could see no basis for charges against anyone involved in the incident. This legal neutrality, while frustrating to white supremacist extremists, effectively legitimized the Protection League's existence and established a precedent that organized black self-defense would be tolerated as long as it remained genuinely defensive in nature. The fragile equilibrium that emerged in the months following the confrontation was far from equality or justice, but it represented a significant shift in power dynamics. White supremacist violence, while certainly not eliminated, was substantially reduced because terrorists could no longer count on attacking vulnerable, isolated victims without the risk of encountering organized armed resistance. The message had been sent and received. Black Americans in Charleston and increasingly in other Southern communities, as word of the Protection League spread, were no longer willing to be terrorized without consequence, and they possessed both the means and the will to defend themselves and their communities. The successful confrontation in Charleston sent shockwaves through black communities across the South, as news of the Protection League's stand against the Klan traveled through the informal networks of communication that connected black communities despite the barriers of segregation and oppression. In Atlanta, a group of black veterans led by former Sergeant Tobias Redmond organized the Georgia Defense Coalition, modeling their structure and tactics on what they had learned about the Charleston organization. In Birmingham, Alabama, steel workers who had access to manufacturing equipment began producing and distributing weapons to black neighborhoods, creating arsenals that would remain hidden for decades. In Mississippi, where white terrorism was perhaps most vicious and unchecked, the establishment of armed self-defense networks was more dangerous and had to be conducted with extreme secrecy. Yet even there, groups of black farmers and sharecroppers began coordinating their defenses and warning systems, understanding that isolation made them vulnerable, while organization provided at least some measure of protection. The spread of armed resistance networks represented a significant challenge to the system of racial control that had governed the South since the end of Reconstruction, because that system had always depended upon the threat of violence being entirely one-sided. White supremacy was maintained not merely through actual violence, but through the ever-present threat of violence, the knowledge that any black person who stepped out of line, who challenged white authority, who failed to display proper deference, could be beaten, lynched, or otherwise terrorized, without any realistic hope of justice or protection from the law. When black communities began organizing armed defenses, they disrupted this psychological warfare that had been so effective in enforcing racial subordination. The knowledge that violence might be met with violence, that terrorist attacks might be resisted rather than passively endured, fundamentally altered the calculus that potential lynch mobs had to consider. Many whites who might have participated in racial violence when it seemed safe and consequence-free were less eager to risk their lives in what could become an actual armed confrontation against trained, organized, and determined opponents. However, this spread of armed resistance also provoked increasingly desperate and violent responses from white supremacist organizations that saw their traditional methods of control being challenged. In some communities, the establishment of black self-defense networks led to escalating cycles of violence as white terrorists, unable to attack isolated individuals with impunity, instead launched larger and more heavily armed raids designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. Several black communities that had organized protection leagues found themselves under siege, with white mobs attempting to burn them out or starve them into submission. The economic retaliation was often severe as well, with black business owners who were known to be part of resistance organizations finding their credit cut off, their properties vandalized, and their livelihoods systematically destroyed by coordinated white boycotts and harassment. Yet despite these intensified pressures and the very real costs that organizing resistance entailed, the movement continued to grow, driven by the fundamental recognition that submission to terrorism was not actually safety, but merely a slower form of destruction, and that dignity and self-respect required the willingness to defend one's community even at great personal risk. The proliferation of armed confrontations between white supremacist mobs and organized black self-defense networks eventually forced a response from federal authorities who had largely maintained a policy of non-interference in Southern racial matters since the end of Reconstruction. The Wilson administration, deeply committed to segregation and Southern political interests, was uncomfortable with both the violence of white mobs and the armed resistance of black communities, viewing both as threats to the social order that needed to be suppressed rather than as aggressor and victim requiring different approaches. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who would become infamous for his raids against suspected radicals and communists, initially attempted to frame black self-defense organizations as dangerous radical movements influenced by Bolshevik ideology, an absurd characterization that nevertheless served the political purpose of delegitimizing black resistance while avoiding direct confrontation with white terrorism. Federal investigations were launched into several protection leagues, with agents collecting intelligence on their leadership, membership, and activities, clearly with an eye toward potential prosecution under various laws designed to suppress insurrection and rebellion. However, the federal government's response was complicated by the fact that many members of these black self-defense organizations were decorated veterans who had recently served the nation in World War I. Men who had risked their lives for American democracy and who could not easily be characterized as anti-American radicals or criminals. The American Legion and other veterans organizations, while dominated by white members and leadership, found themselves in an awkward position when federal authorities suggested prosecuting black veterans for organizing to protect their communities from lynch mobs. Some white veterans, particularly those who had served alongside black soldiers in France and witnessed their courage and competence firsthand, spoke out against efforts to disarm or prosecute black veterans, arguing that Americans who had proven their loyalty on the battlefield had earned the right to self-defense at home. This created political complications for the Wilson administration and its successors as they tried to maintain good relations with veterans organizations while simultaneously appeasing Southern Democrats who demanded federal support for white supremacist control of the region. The compromise that eventually emerged was characteristic of the federal government's long history of moral cowardice on racial justice. Rather than protecting black citizens from white terrorism or prosecuting those who organized lynch mobs, federal authorities simply declined to intervene in most situations, essentially washing their hands of the entire matter and allowing local and state governments to determine how these conflicts would be resolved. This hands-off approach meant that black communities were left to defend themselves without any realistic hope of federal protection or support, but it also meant that organized armed resistance would not face coordinated federal prosecution as long as it remained genuinely defensive rather than offensive. The unspoken understanding was that black communities could organize for self-defense if they had the courage and resources to do so, but they would receive no assistance from federal authorities and would be prosecuted swiftly if their defensive actions could be construed as aggression or rebellion. This cynical neutrality reflected the federal government's prioritization of Southern white political support over any moral obligation to protect black citizens' constitutional rights. Yet it also created space within which armed resistance movements could operate and grow, developing the organizational infrastructure and collective experience that would prove invaluable in later civil rights struggles. While armed self-defense against lynch mobs and Klan terrorism was the most visible and dramatic aspect of black resistance in this era, equally important were the economic strategies that black communities developed to build financial independence and reduce their vulnerability to white economic coercion. In Charleston and other cities where protection leagues had established themselves, black business owners and professionals created mutual aid societies and informal banking systems that provided alternatives to white-controlled financial institutions that had long used credit and debt as tools of racial control. Martha Jennings, who had inherited a successful catering business from her mother, emerged as a key figure in organizing what became known as the Cooperative Commerce Circle, a network of black businesses that committed to supporting each other through preferential purchasing, shared resources, and collective bargaining with white suppliers who might otherwise have charged discriminatory prices or refused service altogether. The economic organization complemented armed resistance by reducing black communities' dependence on white employers and creditors who could threaten financial destruction as punishment for political activism or self-defense activities. Black farmers who were part of protection leagues organized themselves into cooperatives that allowed them to purchase equipment and supplies collectively, obtaining better prices and reducing their individual debt burdens that could be called in by hostile white creditors as a form of economic warfare. Skilled tradesmen formed unions that were separate from white labor organizations that excluded them, creating their own apprenticeship systems and quality standards that built reputations for excellence that even white customers had to acknowledge. These economic initiatives required extraordinary discipline and sacrifice, as participants often had to accept lower profits or forego opportunities for individual advancement in order to build collective strength and sustainability. But the leaders of these movements understood that economic vulnerability was the Achilles heel that white supremacists would exploit to punish any community that dared to resist political and social oppression. The economic dimension of resistance also extended to strategic boycotts and consumer activism that targeted white businesses known to be particularly hostile to black rights or active supporters of white supremacist violence. When a department store owner was identified as a major financial contributor to the local Klan organization, black customers simply stopped shopping there, and within months, the business was struggling financially as it discovered that it had been more dependent on black patronage than it had realized. When a newspaper publisher consistently printed inflammatory articles calling for violence against black citizens, black subscribers canceled their subscriptions, and black vendors refused to sell sell the paper, choking off both revenue streams and limiting the publication's influence. These economic pressure tactics were more subtle than armed confrontations, but no less important in the overall strategy of resistance, demonstrating that black communities possessed multiple forms of power beyond physical self-defense, including the power to reward businesses that treated them fairly and to punish those that supported their oppression. The combination of armed self-defense capability and economic organization created a more comprehensive resistance infrastructure that was harder for white supremacists to defeat. Because even if they succeeded in intimidating or disarming the visible military aspect of resistance, the economic and organizational foundations remained intact and could sustain continued struggle. The rise of armed resistance movements and the broader organizational mobilization of black communities in the post-World War I era created significant tensions within black society itself, particularly between generations that had different experiences with and philosophies about how best to challenge white supremacy. The older generation, many of whom had been born into slavery or spent their formative years in the immediate post-emancipation period, had developed survival strategies based on accommodation, careful navigation of white sensibilities, and the avoidance of direct confrontation that might provoke wholesale massacre. These elders, who included many of the most respected ministers, educators, and community leaders, watched the emergence of armed resistance movements with deep anxiety, fearing that confrontational tactics would bring destruction upon black communities that lacked the resources to survive an all-out war with white society. They had witnessed the systematic destruction of black political power during the overthrow of Reconstruction, had seen prosperous black communities burned to the ground by white mobs in places like Wilmington and Tulsa, and believed that survival required strategic deference and the slow accumulation of education, property, and respectability that would eventually earn white acceptance and equal rights. The younger generation, particularly the veterans returning from World War I, had radically different experiences and expectations that made them less willing to accept the accommodationist strategies of their elders. Having fought for democracy in Europe, having been treated with relative respect by French civilians who did not share American racial prejudices, having proven their courage and competence in one of the most brutal wars in human history, these young men returned to the South, unwilling to resume the submissive posture that the older generation considered prudent. Marcus Holloway, a 24-year-old veteran who had been decorated for valor during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, captured this generational split in a heated debate at a community meeting. "You ask us to bow and scrape before men who never showed a fraction of the courage we demonstrated in France, who terrorize women and children under cover of darkness, while calling themselves superior. We have seen the elephant, as soldiers say, and we are not afraid of these cowards. If demanding to be treated as human beings costs us our lives, then at least we will die as men, rather than live as slaves." The internal debates within black communities about the wisdom and morality of armed resistance were often anguished and deeply personal, pitting family members against each other and dividing churches and civic organizations along generational and philosophical lines. Those who favored accommodation could point to real historical precedents where black resistance had provoked devastating white violence, where entire communities had been destroyed because a few individuals had dared to fight back, where the brutal logic of white supremacy dictated that any challenge to racial hierarchy would be met with overwhelming force designed to terrorize the entire black population into submission. They argued that armed resistance was not actually protecting black communities, but rather painting targets on them, inviting the kind of massive retaliation that protection leagues, however well organized and courageous, could not possibly withstand. The proponents of armed resistance, however, countered that accommodation had not actually provided security or advancement, that black communities had been terrorized and economically exploited for generations despite their efforts at respectability and deference, and that the psychological and spiritual costs of living in constant fear and submission were destroying black humanity just as surely as physical violence. They pointed out that white supremacist violence was not actually a response to black provocation, but rather a tool of social control that would continue regardless of black behavior, and that organized resistance at least gave communities some agency and dignity rather than passive victimhood. The black church played a complex and sometimes contradictory role in the emergence of armed resistance movements, reflecting the diversity of theological perspectives and practical concerns that existed within black religious communities. Some ministers, like Reverend Samuel Hutchins in Charleston, provided powerful theological and moral support for armed self-defense, framing it as a righteous response to evil and a necessary protection of God's children from satanic violence. These progressive religious leaders drew upon biblical traditions of righteous warfare, from the Israelites' battles against oppressive nations to Jesus' admonition that those without swords should sell their cloaks to buy one, arguing that Christian faith did not require passive acceptance of murder and terrorism, but rather demanded active protection of the innocent and resistance to evil in all its forms. Sunday sermons in these churches became recruiting grounds for protection leagues, with ministers openly calling upon congregants to organize for defense and framing such organization as a sacred duty rather than a political choice. Other ministers took opposing positions, preaching that violence was inherently sinful regardless of the circumstances, that Christian faith required absolute non-resistance to evil, and that God would ultimately judge and punish the wicked without requiring human intervention. These ministers, who tended to be older and more conservative in their theology, warned that armed resistance would bring down divine judgment upon black communities for taking matters into their own hands rather than trusting in God's justice and timing. They pointed to Jesus' crucifixion as the ultimate model of redemptive suffering, arguing that accepting persecution without violent resistance was the path to moral victory and eventual transformation of hearts and society. Some of these conservative ministers went so far as to refuse church membership or leadership positions to anyone involved with protection leagues, viewing such organizations as fundamentally incompatible with Christian faith and as dangerous temptations that would lead young people astray from the path of righteousness. Despite these theological divisions, most black churches found ways to support resistance efforts even when their official positions were ambiguous or opposed to armed self-defense. Church buildings provided meeting spaces where resistance organizations could gather, communicate, and plan under the cover of religious activities that white authorities were reluctant to interfere with directly. Church networks served as communication systems that could rapidly spread information about threats and mobilize defensive responses across entire communities and even between different cities and towns. Church social events and fundraisers, ostensibly for charitable or religious purposes, often generated resources that were quietly funneled to protection leagues for the purchase of weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. Many ministers who publicly preached non-violence privately blessed and supported young men who joined armed defense organizations, recognizing that their official position was constrained by the need to avoid giving white authorities any excuse to crack down on churches, while their personal sympathies lay with those willing to defend their communities. This pragmatic duality allowed black churches to maintain their institutional legitimacy and protection while still contributing to resistance efforts, walking a careful line between moral witness and practical survival that reflected the impossible choices that black institutions faced in the Jim Crow South. While women's roles in the resistance movement were often focused on intelligence gathering, economic organization, and community support, a smaller number of black women insisted on receiving military training and joining the armed defense networks directly. Beatrice Washington, a 32-year-old schoolteacher who had been widowed when her husband was killed in France during the war, approached Clayton Merriweather with a direct request. She wanted to learn to shoot, to understand military tactics, and to be prepared to defend her home and students with lethal force if necessary. Clayton was initially reluctant, not because he doubted women's capability or courage, but because he feared that white Society would use the image of armed black women as propaganda to generate even greater hysteria and calls for violent suppression of black communities. Beatrice's response was characteristically blunt. So armed black men are acceptable, but armed black women cross some line that will bring down white wrath. Either we have the right to defend ourselves or we don't, and if white folks want to use me protecting my home as an excuse for terrorism, they would find some other excuse if I stayed unarmed and helpless. The argument was persuasive enough that Clayton agreed to train Beatrice and any other women who requested such instruction, leading to the formation of what became informally known as the Sisters Brigade, a group of approximately 20 women who received systematic training in firearms, tactics, and coordination with the larger Protection League network. These women trained primarily on Sunday afternoons at a rural property owned by a sympathetic black landowner, where they could practice shooting and tactical movement away from the scrutiny of white authorities or even most members of their own community, many of whom would have been scandalized by the sight of women handling military weapons and discussing the killing of attackers. The women of the Sisters Brigade developed particular expertise in close-quarters defense, recognizing that if attacks came to black homes and businesses, much of the fighting would occur at short range, where smaller physical size would be less of a disadvantage, and where familiarity with the terrain would provide crucial advantages. The women's participation in armed resistance had profound effects beyond their direct military capability, challenging gender assumptions within black communities themselves and creating a model of female agency and power that would influence future generations of black women activists. Young girls who witnessed these women training and organizing absorbed the message that female strength was not limited to enduring suffering with dignity, but could include active, forceful defense of self and community. The Sisters Brigade also provided crucial capabilities during daytime hours when many men were at work and homes might otherwise be vulnerable to attack, ensuring continuous defensive coverage that a male-only organization could not have provided. Perhaps most importantly, the women's involvement forced a broader conversation within black communities about the full meaning of equality and liberation, challenging those who believed that black advancement could be achieved while maintaining traditional gender hierarchies and demonstrating that genuine freedom required dismantling all forms of subordination and powerlessness, not merely those based on race. The most emotionally charged confrontation involving the Lowcountry Protection League occurred on a cold November night when intelligence reached Dolores Freeman that a group of Klansmen were planning to attack the Douglas School, the primary educational institution serving black children in Charleston. The specific target was the school's new building, which had been constructed through years of fundraising and community sacrifice, and represented a source of immense pride for black families who saw education as the pathway to their children's advancement. The planned attack was motivated partly by this symbolic significance. White supremacists understood that destroying the school would deal a crushing blow to black morale and aspirations, but also by rumors that the building was being used to store weapons and as a meeting place for the Protection League, rumors that were partially true given that Clayton occasionally held strategy meetings in the school's basement after hours. When word of the planned attack reached the community, the response was immediate and comprehensive, involving not just the armed members of the Protection League, but hundreds of parents and community members who converged on the school, determined to prevent its destruction. Mothers and fathers took their children to stay with relatives and then returned to form a human shield around the building, making clear that anyone attempting to burn the school would have to first attack unarmed parents standing in their way. The Protection League positioned its armed members in defensive positions surrounding this civilian protective ring, creating multiple layers of defense that made any attack both militarily difficult and morally repugnant, even by the degraded standards of Klan violence. Throughout the night, Community members maintained a vigil at the school, with church groups organizing shifts to ensure continuous presence, women bringing food and coffee to sustain the defenders, and ministers leading prayers and freedom songs that could be heard blocks away. The Klansmen who had planned to attack the school found themselves facing a scenario they had not anticipated. Rather than a vulnerable target that could be quickly destroyed by a small group of terrorists, they encountered an entire community mobilized for defense, with armed veterans backed by hundreds of civilians who were clearly willing to die to protect their children's school. After hours of surveillance and debate among themselves, the would-be attackers ultimately withdrew without striking, recognizing that any assault would become a massacre that would generate national headlines and potentially bring the federal intervention that Southern whites had long feared. The successful defense of the Douglas School became legendary within Charleston's black community, celebrated not merely as a military victory, but as a demonstration of what collective action and willingness to sacrifice for shared values could accomplish. The school building itself, which still stood decades later, became a symbol of black resistance and community determination, a physical reminder that there had been moments when ordinary people had stood against terrorism and prevailed through courage and unity. The success of armed resistance in preventing immediate physical violence inevitably provoked economic retaliation, as white supremacists sought alternative methods to punish and suppress black communities that dared to defend themselves. In the months following the confrontation over the Douglas School, black workers throughout Charleston found themselves facing coordinated job losses as white employers systematically dismissed anyone suspected of involvement with the Protection League or its support networks. Clayton Merriweather, whose carpentry skills had previously made him a sought-after craftsman employed on numerous construction projects throughout the city, found himself unable to secure work as white contractors spread the word that hiring him would result in their own businesses being boycotted by white customers and suppliers. Dolores Freeman's dressmaking shop lost its entire white clientele as white women were pressured by their husbands and fathers to find other seamstresses, cutting her income by more than half despite her reputation for exceptional workmanship. The economic warfare extended beyond individual employment to include coordinated efforts to destroy black businesses through various forms of harassment and sabotage. Black-owned stores found their insurance policies suddenly cancelled or premiums raised to unaffordable levels, making it impossible to protect their investments against fire or theft. Banks called in loans that had previously been current, demanding immediate repayment that few borrowers could provide and resulting in foreclosures on homes and businesses that had taken years to build. White wholesalers refused to sell goods to black retailers or charged such inflated prices that the businesses could not compete with white-owned stores that received favorable terms. The goal was clear: to create such severe economic pressure that black families would be forced to choose between continued resistance and basic survival, betting that hunger and homelessness would accomplish what lynch mobs had failed to achieve. However, the economic retaliation also galvanized the black community to accelerate and deepen the economic cooperation and mutual aid networks that had been developing alongside the armed resistance movement. The cooperative commerce circle expanded dramatically as black businesses and professionals committed to supporting each other, even at significant personal cost, with those who still had resources helping to sustain those who were being specifically targeted by white economic warfare. Martha Jennings' catering business, which served both black and white clients, discreetly funneled profits to families facing eviction or starvation, while black professionals like doctors and lawyers provided their services at reduced rates or even free of charge to those impacted by the economic retaliation. Black churches took up special collections to create emergency funds that could provide interest-free loans to members facing financial crisis, while farmers who owned their land outright shared their harvests with urban families struggling to afford food. This intensified economic solidarity demonstrated that resistance was not merely about armed confrontation, revolutions, but about building sustainable communities capable of withstanding multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. The armed resistance movements that emerged in the aftermath of World War I, while ultimately unable to overthrow the Jim Crow system entirely, had profound and lasting impacts on black political consciousness and organizational capacity that would prove crucial in later civil rights struggles. The experience of organizing effective self-defense networks taught a generation of black activists practical lessons about coordination, security, communications, and the importance of discipline and training that would be applied to various forms of civil rights organizing in subsequent decades. Young people who witnessed their parents and community standing up to white terrorism with courage and effectiveness developed a sense of agency and possibility that contrasted sharply with the defeated resignation that had characterized some earlier generations. Understanding that resistance was possible and that collective action could achieve results even against overwhelming odds. The organizational infrastructure created by protection leagues and their associated economic and social networks provided foundations upon which later civil rights organizations would build, establishing patterns of leadership, communication, and mobilization that persisted long after the specific threat of lynch mobs had receded. Many of the individuals who led armed resistance in the 1920s went on to become key figures in NAACP chapters, voter registration drives, and other civil rights activities, bringing with them the organizational skills and fearlessness they had developed during the earlier struggles. The next generation, including those who would lead the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, grew up hearing stories of the Protection League and similar organizations, understanding that their parents and grandparents had not passively accepted oppression, but had fought back with whatever means were available to them. The historical memory of armed resistance also complicated and enriched debates within the civil rights movement about the appropriate tactics for challenging segregation and white supremacy. While the mainstream narrative of the civil rights movement emphasizes nonviolent resistance and moral suasion, this emphasis has sometimes obscured the reality that armed self-defense remained an important component of black survival and resistance throughout the Jim Crow era, and even during the height of nonviolent civil rights campaigns. The SCLC and other organizations publicly committed to nonviolence were often protected by armed black citizens who guarded meeting places, defended movement leaders, and deterred white violence through their visible presence and readiness to fight back if attacked. This complex relationship between nonviolent, public activism and armed self-defense reflected the pragmatic recognition that different tactics served different purposes and that successful resistance required multiple strategies deployed simultaneously rather than rigid adherence to any single approach. The story of the Lowcountry Protection League and similar armed resistance movements represents both an inspiring chapter of black courage and a sobering reminder of the persistent nature of white supremacy in American society. While these organizations successfully prevented many instances of racial terrorism and provided their communities with a measure of dignity and agency that passive submission could never have achieved, they did not and could not fundamentally transform the structures of racial oppression that governed Southern society and, in different forms, shaped American society as a whole. The Jim Crow system survived these challenges, adapting its methods but maintaining its essential character of white supremacist domination through legal segregation, economic exploitation, and political disenfranchisement that would persist for decades after the confrontations of the post-World War I era. The armed resistance movements won important tactical victories and psychological triumphs that mattered immensely to those directly involved, but the strategic victory of genuine equality and justice remained elusive, requiring subsequent generations to take up the struggle with different tactics and strategies suited to changing historical circumstances. The legacy of armed resistance in Black history has often been downplayed or erased from popular historical narratives, partly because it complicates comfortable stories about American progress, and partly because it challenges myths about the alleged passivity of oppressed people. The dominant narrative of civil rights history tends to emphasize legal victories, non-violent protests, and moral appeals to American ideals, creating a sanitized version of the freedom struggle that white audiences can celebrate without confronting the more disturbing realities of sustained white terrorism and the armed Black resistance it provoked. Yet for the communities involved, the memory of standing up to lynch mobs and protecting their schools, churches, homes, and families remained a source of pride and strength that was passed down through generations, a reminder that dignity sometimes requires the willingness to fight, and that freedom without the capacity for self-defense is fragile and conditional. As contemporary America continues to grapple with racial injustice, police violence, and the resurgence of white supremacist movements, the history of armed Black resistance offers important lessons about the nature of oppression and the requirements of effective resistance. The story of the Lowcountry Protection League and similar organizations demonstrates that oppressive systems do not voluntarily relinquish power in response to moral arguments alone, that meaningful change often requires that those in power face consequences for maintaining injustice, whether those consequences are economic, political, or the threat of armed resistance to violence. It reminds us that the American promise of equality and justice has never been freely given, but has always had to be fought for, sometimes literally, by those excluded from its benefits. And it challenges us to consider what forms of resistance are necessary and appropriate in our own time, recognizing that each generation must find its own answers to the eternal questions of how to confront injustice, how to build power for the powerless, and how to create a society where human dignity is not something that must be defended weapon in hand, but is instead recognized as the inalienable right of every person. The struggle continues, informed by the courage of those who came before, knowing that the arc of history bends toward justice only when people are willing to pull it in that direction, with determination, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to human freedom.